Hey there friends, hope you're all doing well. I did change my setup a little bit. It's kind of a little bit different. I had this screen behind the camera now and it's over here. Kind of changed a couple other things around, so hopefully it looks good. We'll kind of test this out today and see how it ends up looking. With that being said, I do want to remind you guys to wash your hands and abide by CDC guidelines as much as possible. And kind of on that note, there's been a lot of articles about megachurches and pastors recently kind of having very interesting responses to COVID-19. So I wanted to take some time today and go through some of the history of the church and maybe offer perspective on this conversation that not a lot of people are talking about. Some of you guys may not actually know this, but I have a degree in religious histories. I went to school for about 5 years at a religious university, and so this is kind of the background that I come from. It's one of the things that I do have a little bit of expertise on and background in, so hopefully what I'll be able to do is offer some of the historical context to this conversation and maybe propose, based off of that, an alternate response to what's going on right now. A good note to make here is that I'm not making any arguments from like a theological perspective. I'm just simply going to be looking at things from a historical and practical standpoint, because at the end of the day, I'm not going to be attacking the people themselves or their beliefs or how they're using those beliefs to handle people. I'm specifically going to be just looking at their response to COVID-19 and not their whole kind of career. First, let me start with a little bit of historical context so you know where this is all kind of coming from. Christianity started out as a sect of Judaism known as the Way. And basically, in the beginning, Judaism kind of revolved around two separate kind of meeting places, the synagogue and the temple. Obviously, most of their practices were something that you could do day to day with your family or with your person, but they did have places that they met on the weekends and on special occasions that they would see as a symbol of their faith or of their religion. The synagogues were places where rabbis or priests would read out scripture so that the people would be able to understand the Torah and the Pentateuch, which were their religious documents. And then the temple was a central meeting place that was a symbol of Judaism and where some of the main practices for like priests exist. So priests would be there offering sacrifices and all kinds of other stuff. And that was kind of the purpose of the temple and kind of why it was there. Now, for the subsect of Judaism known as the Way, they weren't really necessarily focused as much on the temple or on synagogues. At least that's what they were told not to do by some of their religious leaders. They were focused on more day-to-day communal kind of socialistic ideas in the sense that they would share everything that they had with other people, that they would meet day to day in different houses and kind of talk about their faith or talk about their lifestyles and what they could do to help people. And a lot of what would become the New Testament would be religious leaders talking to specific groups like this that met in houses or in smaller kind of communal settings. The important thing here, though, is that the Way, again, was not focused on these symbolic buildings like Judaism was. They weren't focused on the synagogues. They weren't focused on the temple. They were focused on their day-to-day meetings with people. For a long time, about 70 years, these people kind of still gathered around the temple, still gathered around synagogue, which was great for them, again, because most people didn't have access to the specific scriptures on their own, so they would either memorize it or go to synagogue. Okay, so around 72 CE, the Romans invaded the area that the temple was located in and this kind of central hub for Judaism and the Way, and burned it to the ground. And that caused a massive dispersion of these religious practitioners, both Christians and Jewish people, because they no longer had this central building, the synagogues and the temple, to kind of gather around. And so there was no kind of central place for their faith. And because of that, they kind of spread out and pretty much traveled away from what they would have considered home. Now, for the next 200 years, Christianity was in a really weird place because Christians at the time had started to become known as Christians, and they were starting to be recognized as their own thing outside of just Judaism. Judaism had some sort of political and social weight at the time, but Christianity didn't have any. So when it came to political leaders or, social leaders trying to find something to blame all the issues of society on, there was this group of people, this new religious group that had a lot of different beliefs compared to the standing Greek and Roman traditions and had no political or social weight. And so a lot of persecution happened during that time because it was easy for empires and emperors to do that. And so again, during this whole time, people would meet in their houses to kind of meet together to practice their faith. They would, have dinner together and kind of talk over their ideas and, what they were trying to do. And that was kind of the center of Christianity at the time. It wasn't a big building. It wasn't a cathedral. It wasn't any of that. And then along came Constantine. Now, Constantine was an emperor, first one to legalize Christianity. And it was from then on that really they gained that political and social standing that they needed, and they were recognized as being part of society. But the interesting thing that Constantine did during this time is offer up basilica, these kind of Roman meeting places places as places for Christians to gather, Christian communities to gather. And it was at this point that the basilica, or this meeting place, became known as the church. Up until this point, the church was the group of people. It was the community gathered. It didn't matter on the building, but just that there was people gathered there. But from that point on, because of Constantine and how he offered up these basilicas to these groups of people, it kind of started to become synonymous. Instead of the church meaning the group of people, the church now meant this meeting place. And this kind of continued and developed all the way up until the modern day, to with even like modern Christian movements, a lot of them put a lot of weight in the place that they meet and having a specific place that's their own, outside of putting the focus on just the meeting of people and not the building that the people are meeting in. Now, this certainly isn't a full in-depth review of the whole history of the church, and if you're wanting to look at that, there's articles that I'll link below that kind of talk through that. But this is kind of a synopsis and something that I think adds a little bit of new perspective on what's going on today. The reason that I wanted to kind of mention that specific kind of historical development is that Christianity at its core is not centered around buildings, even though today in its modern movement it's really focused on the specific meeting places that these people gather in. There's really kind of a contrast between, you know, the central principles and kind of how it's practiced today with a lot of people that call themselves Christians. At most modern church services nowadays, the pastor will at some point mention their expansion plan or their building plan. If they don't have a building of their own, they're trying to get one. If they do have a building of their own, they're trying to expand it, which is not a bad thing in any way, but it points out a specific kind of interest or focus that churches usually have today. For example, there's Gateway Church, who just launched their $140 million renovation program and expansion program to renovate all of their campuses, and I think to create a couple new ones. And they specifically cite in their kind of video promoting all of this that they're trying to make space for a new generation of people. I think that's also something really important to point out that I will talk on a little bit later on. I'll also list, if I can find some different articles on the basic expenses of modern church buildings and these mega churches, specifically places that are singularly used for meeting in church and nothing else. So that way you have a little bit of context of what I'm talking on. For me, I live in Texas, and Gateway is a larger church in this area. There's also Life Church and a couple other ones, and all of these guys have their specific expansion plans and their specific videos on that I'll try to link to below. And so far, there's no problems with any of the things that I've said. Basically, you know, churches are allowed to do whatever they want. These, you know, organizations, you know, have the right to take the money that they've gathered in and do whatever they feel like doing with it. But I specifically wanted to show the kind of difference between, you know, Christianity in general, or its kind of core principles, and how it's practiced today, especially because of how society started to shift. Today, a lot of the things that used to be done in person are really done online. You know, even when it came to gaming 10 years ago, you know, while it would be done at like LAN parties, a lot of gaming is just completely done online today. And that's the same thing for art. You know, we have digital tablets and we have digital drawing techniques to where we can do and create art online and then share it with other people online without ever having to see them in person. And the same thing comes for even most social interaction, in the sense that Twitter and Instagram and YouTube and Twitch are all great places that people can go to kind of interact with other people online. They don't ever have to see people in person. Discord's another great place for this, you know, especially for me. When I was gaming a lot, I would spend a lot of time on Discord talking to people that I couldn't even meet in person because there was no way for me to actually go physically see them. They'd be in Denmark or Europe, Germany, Brazil, any of that kind of stuff. Any of those places, you know, that I don't have the immediate ability to go fly to right now. And so I would say the shift isn't positive for everybody, but I would say it's definitely a positive shift in the sense that we're more connected to people now than ever before, and we don't really have to leave our houses to find communities that we're close to, that we want to interact with, and that we want to spend time with. I'll put a couple of articles below if I can to kind of show this shift away from specific larger gatherings of people in person. Malls are a great example of this, zoos and parks and stuff like that, and so I'll mention those in articles below so you guys can check that out. And so specifically when it comes back to that Gateway video, there's nothing wrong with what they're saying or doing, but one of the arguments that they mention is that they're trying to build these places for people to meet and for the next generation to come to. And what the statistics show, and what you can probably attest to yourself, is that a lot of people aren't really going outside as much as they used to anymore, and meetings are more kind of personal, one-on-one. There's a lot smaller friend groups that kind of get together now versus larger groups of people or larger communities, such as, you know, places like malls and zoos and public parks. Now, concerts are still going, you know, really strong, and a lot of other places like that, but those are kind of specialized meetings and not continual places for people to kind of interact and spend time together. And so specifically when it comes to Christian meeting places, these churches, it seems like there's a disproportionate amount of money being put into the specific meeting place versus the actual group of people. So again, this isn't really a review of all of the facts or all of the kind of support for this. I'm sure there's other variables that kind of influence this conversation that a lot of people could talk through and that probably need to be talked through, but this is kind of a 30,000 foot perspective of this conversation and some of the dissonance that I've been seeing in some of these building projects and kind of how culture is shifting. All of this brings us to the COVID-19 pandemic and how people are reacting to it. The CDC has guided people not to meet in groups larger than 5, to cut out all non-essential travel and kind of interaction with people, and there's a laundry list of other things that it recommends for social distancing. States have specifically put mandates in place to make non-essential interactions actually illegal and have put a lot of guidelines on how the public can interact and what they're allowed to do. A lot of shelter-in-home orders have been issued, and there's massive amounts of layoffs happening day after day in the United States. I think this week it was 7 million people that filed for unemployment. Last week it was 10 million, and the week before that it was 6 million. So lots and lots of people without jobs that are mandated to stay home at the moment. And that's definitely changing or massively impacting the way that people are interacting on the day-to-day basis. And when it comes to religious organizations and churches and megachurches, whatever the case may be, most of those places can't actually meet or have services because either they're A, physically mandated against being able to hold services, or B, because they've been guided by the CDC to not have services and so have kind of shut down. And this means that all of the money and all of the effort that they put into building these buildings is really kind of going to waste right now, in the sense that they have massive buildings with lots of tech and a lot of effort put into, you know, the design of them without the ability to have anybody gather there or to use those specific buildings. Now, some people might say, well, hey, you know, everything's going to be fine, right? The cases are already on decline in America, and so everything's going to be all right. In a couple weeks, everything will be back to normal, so why does this even matter? Well, as a lot of people have talked about and kind of warned, this is only the first modern pandemic that we've had to deal with on a worldwide scale. And it's not even really that dangerous in the sense that it's only a 2 to 4% mortality rate. Now, it is a lot more dangerous for people that have pre-existing health conditions and all that, and I'm very, very aware of that, but in a sense that it's not like the measles to where it's a 15% mortality rate. And so there's a very big chance that something like this could spread again, and it could be much, much worse than it is right now. And a lot of governments are noticing that, and a lot of people are kind of bracing for that kind of impact in the future. A lot of businesses have been alerted to this factor and are kind of changing the way that they're doing things to try to respond to it. Basically, the way that we're doing things right now, with all of these new health practices and recommendations from the CDC, may become something that we actually have to do on a more consistent basis or on a more habitual basis, just so that we limit a spread of a virus like this again. We're more than connected than ever before to all of the different people in the world and all the different societies, and because there's so much travel, you know, it's pretty much just a matter of time before the next virus starts to massively spread across the world. And again, we'll probably see governments put a lot of mandates in place in the future because most economies can't handle a shutdown like this again, and they're going to respond in a way that allows them to continue to operate and have a successful business and structure without worry of closing down like this again, or, you know, the fear that their workforce literally won't be able to work or something like that. So all of it to say that this might not happen, but it seems like normal, after all of this is over, is going to look different than normal did before we had this whole crisis. There will probably be a lot of leftover mandates or rules in place by states and cities to try to protect their people. There'll probably be social distancing guidelines put in place or recommended to everybody. And for the people that are just operating on their own, they might try to start wearing masks more and gloves and, you know, reducing interactions with people that they don't have to have or that are not essential. And with all of this together, it seems kind of like the perfect storm for meeting places or megachurch kind of community gatherings. So what's the solution here? Well, some pastors have started to lobby and say that closing down churches is an infringement on religious freedoms granted by the Constitution, and that makes this whole pandemic shutdown something that goes against religious freedom and that churches should open back up. But I don't know if that's necessarily the most positive response in this case. Again, what we're noticing with all of these different pastors is this really heavy importance put on the buildings that they meet in, because they put a lot of money and effort and, you know, a lot of finances into these kinds of projects. And again, this shift in focus from just a group of people meeting to a specific building building is kind of universal in the sense that even the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church focuses on that. Modern megachurches really put a lot of weight into their building projects and their expansion projects, and that's kind of the focus of a lot of these people. Whereas again, at the past, in principle, Christianity was about groups of people, communities, but not necessarily meeting in person or in buildings. It was just centered around that idea of community. At least from my study and the degree that I have, I would say that Christianity doesn't necessarily need to focus around buildings, or it's not required to. And there's a lot of other things that could be benefited by, the finances that would usually be put towards kind of building projects. There's other things like welfare that Christians have participated in that this kind of shift away from buildings could really benefit, in the sense that they'd have more money or more freedom to offer their finances to help their community versus trying to find a place that community could meet. And again, with Zoom and Vimeo and YouTube and Discord and all these places, there's a massive amount of ways that people can meet online and still gather in communities and still help each other out without it having to be at a specific singular building. And so especially with all of these megachurch pastors putting so much weight into their buildings, I don't know if that's necessarily the most appropriate response, especially when it comes back to the principle of what makes Christianity Christianity. So again, this isn't like a full explanation of everything going on. There's a lot more variables that I haven't talked about, but I think it's a new perspective on kind of this conversation right now, and something that I think that could definitely positively impact the way that churches operate. Instead of focusing on buildings, kind of focusing on their communities and people as it was, 1500 or so years ago. A final reminder to wash your hands and stay safe. But with that all being said, that's it for this video, and I will see you guys in the next one.